Well, good morning and welcome to American Experiments podcast. I'm David Zimmer, the Public Safety Policy Fellow with Center of the American Experiment, and I'm joined today by Walter Hudson, first-term representative with the Minnesota Legislature. Welcome, Walter.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah. Well, you chose quite a year last year to join the legislature. I'm wondering, what is your biggest takeaway from that session? It was certainly a whirlwind session in terms of quantity of legislation that came out. What was your takeaway?
I would say, there are a lot of components that I could fit underneath this category, but the overall takeaway is that there's a complete disconnect between people's values and the political outcomes that they are seeing, the legislative outcomes that they are seeing, your governance. Your values and your governance are completely disconnected. That's intentional. We have in this country, and particularly in this state, this mythology of democracy where people still kind of believe that the man on the street has an opinion that matters and has some sort of impact upon what the law is going to be and how it's going to be implemented. Nothing could be further from the truth. Everything is set up to either ignore you or compel you. Your feedback is often not solicited. We've seen plenty of examples of that in the last legislative session. And to the extent that it's offered unsolicited, has no impact, has no traction, makes no difference.
Did you find that demoralizing? Was it a surprise to you, just kind of how maybe powerless you were at times?
The word I think that best encapsulates it is clarifying. I found it clarifying because I think a lot of us operate with this kind of instinctive suspicion and this kind of instinctive cynicism regarding the status quo of politics generally. But we don't necessarily know why or what the underlying driving force is. And so that's kind of like the fertile soil from which conspiracy theories and things pop up. But when you get that insider view and you actually see how the sausage is made, you get back in the kitchen and see how they roll up the burritos. You realize that one of the axioms that pop into mind is never attribute to malice what can be explained by stupidity. There's a certain extent to which this is just people being people doing what people do. But at the same time, there are institutional forces. They're not secret. They're not hidden. It's not a conspiracy in the sense of being in the shadows. They're right out in the open with what their agenda and focus is. And their purpose is to mute you. Sometimes quite literally, but to kind of suppress the extent to which your views, your norms, your traditions, your culture, your values have any sort of meaningful expression in the public square.
Okay. So you serve on the Public Safety Policy and Finance Committee, among others. Tell us about that experience and what led you to that committee. Something about your background or your interests?
There were three policy areas that I was primarily interested in when I ran and when I was elected. The top one was public safety. I felt as though, that's an area that, look, the primary reason for which we have government is to uphold individual rights from encroachment from those who would abuse us in some way. And the most obvious and overt way that happens is through criminal activity, through people violating your rights, assaulting you, taking your property. And so public safety is very important. The other two areas that I was interested in was education and energy. And the through line between those three policy areas is that each and every one of them touches everything. Like there's no aspect of life that isn't affected by your capacity to live without interference, the initiation of force by others, or your ability to successfully negotiate reality, which is the education piece, or your ability to move, right?
Sure,
like the ability to actually get up and go, which is the energy aspect. So I was blessed with being able to hit 2 out of the 3, public safety most directly with the Public Safety Committee, and then education with the Children and Families Committee, which is kind of a hodgepodge of early childhood education with some health and human services stuff mushed together.
Sure. Well, let's dig into some of the public safety activity of last session and whether or not there's any room for optimism in the next session. From my takeaway of this past year in 2023, there seemed to be this torrent of activity around public safety, but none of it seemed to be very productive in terms of offender accountability. We're just coming off years of historic highs in violent crime in our state and a marked increase in the randomness of crime, people being carjacked in their driveways coming home from the grocery store and that type of thing. I felt like Minnesotans were hungry for meaningful legislation that held offenders accountable. But what we got was a lot of offender-centric legislation that really was aimed at improving the lives of the offenders. I jotted down some of the names of some of the legislation. Clemency review, capping probation at 5 years, automatic expungement of criminal records, early release from prison, prosecutor-initiated sentence reduction, supervision abatement, felon voting laws, and it just went on and on and on. Being there live, what was your feeling and takeaway of the direction the DFL was taking public safety legislation in 2023?
Well, your characterization is entirely accurate. It was definitely offender-centric in terms of the focus of who it is that we're serving. I mean, they would trot out, they've got kind of their politically organized victim groups so that they can claim that they're representing the interests of victims as they're moving forward with their policies. But in reality, the first person that they're thinking about when they conceptualize what should we do about crime is the perpetrator of that crime. They see crime because they're looking at everything through, they have this, I'll just be frank about it, they have this Marxist critical theory lens through which they view everything. And actually on the way over here, I heard Jordan Peterson characterize it very succinctly. He said the currency of social relationship is power in their view. That's how they see everything. And they also have this kind of inherent sense that everybody can be fixed and everybody is just, if somebody is broken, it's because we broke them. It's not because of any choice that they made or anything that they did. And so the first person who they're looking at when they see a crime is, oh, that poor perpetrator. Yeah. How did we fail them as a society to drive them to do something so terrible? Victim, you stay out over there. We'll get to you eventually, maybe give you some counseling services or something along those lines. But let's focus on this guy. Let's focus on this gal. Let's see what it is that they need. Let's get them some housing. Let's get them some education. Let's bring them up. Because, again, you're dealing with this kind of social equity priority that they've set where they want everybody to have equal outcomes. And so the person, in their view, in the long term, the person who's going to have the worst outcome, obviously, is the person who's going to prison, right? So that's the person who we need to lift up, either by diverting them from that path or making up for whatever deficit led them to make that terrible decision.
So I see you authored some legislation trying to maybe turn the tables on that direction. One important piece of legislation was trying to get at repeat offenders and ensuring that people that committed, let's say, 3 violent felonies in their life actually did some prison time. Can you talk a little bit about that legislation and what you and your colleagues were trying to get at there?
It falls in the category of, I can't even believe this is an argument. Like, how is it? We're talking about 3 violent felony convictions. Like, every one of those words suggests, of course, this person should be in prison. 3 violent felony convictions. Not, we think they did something. We know beyond a reasonable doubt, and it's been proven in a court of law 3 times, that this person has engaged in a violent felony. Why in God's name would we provide them the opportunity to do it a 4th time? You would think that that would be completely uncontroversial. And again, going back to my original point, my original takeaway, which is that there's a complete disconnect between values and governance in this state. You go out and you talk to virtually anyone on the street and ask them, do you think somebody who's committed 3 violent felonies should go to prison? The answer is overwhelmingly going to be yes. That is not reflected in the process. And so the pushback that I got, I mean, this was the top bill when I would get someone from the other side, a restorative justice advocacy group or whatever, come to me and when I have a conversation about public safety, this was the top thing that they would bring up as kind of like a wag their finger and what are you thinking of, really, you want to send people to prison? And it's like, no, I don't want to send random people to prison.
Right.
I want to send people who have had 3 violent felony convictions to prison, because what else are we supposed to do with them?
I couldn't agree more. So the Sentencing Guideline Commission just issued their report to the legislature for 2024. It oddly reflects data from 2022, but that's the most recent data we have to work with. So as of 2022, Minnesota remained among the lowest rates of incarceration in the country. We had some of the highest rates of supervision, probation. So we are a state that values punishing people by keeping them out in the community and keeping them in the street.
Can I interject real quick?
Sure.
Just to point out, you brought up earlier Majority Leader Long's bill to cap probation at 5 years.
Yes.
So when he came to the Public Safety Committee to argue for that bill, he made it very clear that the outcomes you just cited of low rates of imprisonment and high rates of supervision are the intended policy outcomes of what they have crafted in this state over time. They want the ratio to be that. They want fewer people in prison and more people on probation. And it's in that context that he argued to cap probation to 5 years.
Right.
What does that tell you?
Speaks volumes to me, and hopefully the public is catching on as they watch. Record number of felony cases in 2022, 16,259, but nearly 40% fell within presumptive prison sentencing categories. Yet only a quarter of those received actual prison time. I think this gets back to the legislation that you proposed, that we need to start holding the people that are committing these violent crimes accountable. Did you get a chance to look at that legislative report, and did you have any takeaways that you hope to bring back to the 24 session and kind of use that as a foundation for getting some traction on some of these things?
Well, I did, in fact, look at the 125-page report. I cannot say that I thoroughly read it, but I did read your excellent summary that you have posted on the Center of the American Experiment website, and got the essential bullet points from there. And, you know, none of it is surprising from my perch as a member of the House Public Safety Committee. But I think what's interesting to note is that these results are validating up for both sides. So like neither the majority or the minority is looking at these numbers and thinking we should sweep these under a rug. These numbers are bad for us. From their perspective, this is victory. From their perspective, this is exactly what they're aiming for. They think this is good, that we have had decreasing rates of incarceration and increasing rates of supervision and what have you. And for our side, it bolsters our argument that we're headed in the wrong direction. And so really what you're looking at here is a worldview conflict where you have one side that, as you've repeatedly stated, and I agree with, is looking at this and saying we need to hold offenders accountable for the choices that they've made, which I'll just pause to say, that is the position that respects human dignity on both sides of the transaction, because it obviously respects the human dignity of the victim, that we're saying we value your life so much that we're going to hold your assailant accountable to violating its sanctity. So that's one half of the equation. But it's also validating the perpetrator. It's saying you are a moral agent who is empowered with the responsibility and the dignity and the image of God, the responsibility to make good, productive decisions. You failed to do that, and we're going to hold you accountable because you are a free moral agent and because we respect you as a human being. To do otherwise is to treat them like animals. Oh, they didn't know what they were doing. Right. Or they couldn't possibly have made a different decision. They're just following their instincts, which is incredibly dehumanizing, and I think actually the truly discriminatory position.
I think that could lead us into a discussion on restorative justice, and I want to get there at the end, but before we move on, the Sentencing Guideline Commission has been tasked by the legislature to do a comprehensive review of the guidelines, and my take on their pending review is that they're going to take these departure rates that their own report highlights. So there's unfortunately very high rates of departure. So judges are departing from the guidelines in a downward way. 55% of aggravated assaults get a downward dispositional departure. A third of aggravated robberies get a downward durational departure. So it appears as though the sentencing guidelines are going to view that as the guidelines are wrong, not the judges, not the judges' actions. And just wondering what your take is on that, and if there's anything the minority in the legislature can do to maybe help focus that comprehensive review.
I would absolutely agree with that take and that analysis. And again, none of this is secretive. None of this is conspiratorial. It is kind of all out in the open. And when you listen to these folks on the left talk for any length of time, they will shamelessly come out and tell you that their objective is to end imprisonment. Like, they don't think, like, if you actually go to the Department of Corrections website, I forget exactly where it is, but you will find reference to one of their priorities being zero warehousing. Do you know what that means? That means nobody in prison. That's what their goal is, and they are the Department of Corrections. And so it's in that context that you have to view everything else that they're doing. So when I go on tours with the Public Safety Committee to the various correctional institutions throughout the state, and I hear the pleas for we have these needs, we don't have enough personnel in order to meet all these programming mandates, our roofs are caving in, we've got leaky windows, whatever it is, we don't have enough room. When you hear all these complaints, you have to realize, you have to come to the conclusion that there's an intentionality behind that, right? They want to be able to say, well, we can't send somebody to prison. And judges have said, well, I can't send anybody to prison, this guy to prison, because there's not enough space right now. There isn't a bed available. Build a bed. Right? Fix the roof. Like, have your focus be, instead of adjusting the guidelines, instead of lowering the grading standards so that you score an A at 40%, how about we actually figure out how to score 90%?
Exactly. Well, let's move on to this discussion on restorative justice. I think it's one that a lot of people don't know what it means. They've heard the term. I think a lot of conservatives tend to bristle at the idea because it sounds maybe soft on crime. But what's your understanding of restorative justice, and where do you find some value in it as a conservative?
So as often is the case, there's what the left means when they use the term restorative justice, and there's what I glean from it as having value. And those are two totally different things. Just to give you some context. So if you look at like biblical examples, like we go back to the Old Testament and the way that what we would regard as criminal activity was dealt with in those days, there were really two tiers. One was you're dead. Like there was a lot of capital punishment for things back in those days. But absent that, there wasn't a jail system. There wasn't a prison system. What they did was they did a lot of restitution. They did a lot of, you're going to pay this person back. sevenfold, right? Like you're going to not only make them whole for the material loss, but you're going to compensate them for having gone through what you put them through. And I think that there's a principle there that is, quite frankly, divine and correct, right? And that we would do well as a society to reevaluate our criminal justice system to see where there are opportunities to mimic that and to incorporate that into the process for the purpose of making victims whole primarily,
Right.
but then also reincorporating, because the kind of the unspoken premise there, or maybe it is spoken in certain passages, is that if we're not going to take this guy out into the wilderness and stone him, if we're going to keep him in the camp, then it's in our interest and his for him to become a good guy, right? For him to find his place, for him to be reincorporated back into the social order. And so that's the aspect of restorative justice that I find value in. Like, to the extent that my Democrat colleagues are talking about the fact that 90% or whatever the statistic is of people who are currently incarcerated are at some point going to reenter the community. What do we want that reentry to look like? How do we want their lives to pick up from where they left off when they reenter the community? We don't want recidivism. We don't want to have more victims in the future. These are all totally positive, good motivations. Here's the problem. The way in which the left, and Democrats in particular, are implementing this idea is at the exclusion of and in replacement of holding offenders accountable. So we use all these words, right? Public safety, accountability, holding people accountable. Those terms mean something completely different to the Democrats than they do to me and you and probably anybody on the street. When you listen to a restorative justice activist talk about accountability, they are not talking about serving time. They are talking about sitting around in a circle talking about what you did and sitting there and nodding with your head down and kicking the ground and being like, yeah, you're right, I was wrong. That's their version of accountability. Now, I love that process. That's great. We should do that. Like, I want people to confront what they've done and to have that reformation and to reenter society ready to work, ready to be a contributing member of society. But that's not a replacement for paying the price
Exactly.
for what you did, right? Like you have to have that accountability in the true sense of the word of paying a punitive price for the crime that you committed. And I'll tell you what, if you want to make a Democrat bristle in their seat and wiggle and worm, you bring up the word punitive in a public safety committee meeting and you're going to get that effect.
Okay. Yeah, I view it as, in order for any of this to work, there has to be an element of incarceration or incapacitation. We have to be able to pull the person out of society and keep society safe while we work on that person.
Yes.
And so I think conservatives can certainly get behind the idea that we want people that coming out of prison to be better than when they went in, certainly. And this is certainly a way to do that, but it has to start and end with this element of incapacitation, or it is just not going to be successful. Is there anything in 2024 that you'll be working on with your colleagues in terms of restorative justice?
I don't know that there will necessarily be a specific focus on restorative justice as such. I feel as though the Democrats have put such an emphasis on it that it places us in a position where we kind of have to come along on the coattails and say, hey, what about accountability? What about holding offenders accountable? And so that has largely been our focus. I think if we retake the majority, then we're going to have some really interesting conversations.
Okay.
Because then suddenly I'm going to be the best friend of a lot of Democrats and lefties who care about this issue on the Public Safety Committee, assuming I remain on it, because I'm perhaps not the only, but certainly one of the few Republicans who are willing to entertain what the merits in that concept are. And I do think there are real merits. You know, I sat on the Public Safety Committee, had a presentation from Yellow Medicine County who incorporates a lot of these ideas. They use what they call a circle. and it's literally what I described before, where, here's what you did, shame on you, how can we do better, let's come up with ways to reintegrate and to be a better person. Right now they're using it exclusively with juvenile offenders as a kind of a diversion from the juvenile justice system. And they report remarkable success, both in terms of the reduction in cost to the county and also recidivism and outcomes. And all of that is fantastic, but it's not a replacement for holding people accountable. Here's what where the danger is. The danger is that if you have all this focus on making life better for the offender without making them suffer a consequence for having violated the rights of another person, then crime becomes like a scholarship, right? It's like, I earned a scholarship by carjacking somebody. And now I'm going to go to this institution where they're going to train me, they're going to feed me, they're going to give me housing, they're going to provide me all these services, and I come out the other end better off than before, and I didn't have to suffer any downside, really, right? We can't have that. Like, I'm all about people getting what they need in terms of attention to re-enter the society successfully, but there has to be a painful process that they have to endure as a consequence for the violation that they put on another person and for society as a whole. Because if there is not, then there is no incentive for them to not do that in the first place. And you're actually providing an incentive in a perverse way for them to engage in that behavior in the first place.
I couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. So as we wrap up today, are there any words of encouragement for conservatives looking at the 2024 legislative session in terms of public safety? What areas of encouragement are there?
There's a couple. There's one general and one specific. The general is the talk around the proverbial water cooler is that leadership in the majority would prefer to get in and get out, to get into session, do some bonding, and get out and do no damage to themselves politically. I have a hard time believing that's how things are going to go down, because there's just so much. There's this dynamic where you have a lot of radicals within their caucus who have priorities that, to their mind, have remained unfulfilled despite what we saw in 2023, and that's coupled with the clock ticking on the election and them fearing that they're going to lose that trifecta. And so they're going to want to get as much crazy stuff done as they possibly can. Specifically, we got that looming issue of SROs, school resource officers, and the language around that. And it's so bizarre how that played out, because Governor Walz acknowledged that it was a problem. Many Democrat legislators acknowledged that it was a problem. And did so in terms that, I mean, if you were doing a blind taste test, you wouldn't know if you were talking to a Democrat or a Republican, right? Because they were saying the same things we were saying. Yeah. This can't work. We got to fix it. Yet they weren't willing to fix it with a special session. They claim that they're going to. Are they? Are they really? I guess that's yet to be seen. That's kind of the top thing that I'm holding my breath, metaphorically, to see what happens.
Yeah, I believe we were promised by some of the leadership that would be the first thing that would be addressed. So we'll see if their word is true here. Yeah. Anything else you want to share going into the 2024 session?
I would just say, look, the biggest threat that we face as conservatives, and just as Minnesotans, like the whole divide between conservative and liberal, left and right, is rapidly just devolving into people who want to live their lives versus people who want to muck it all up. We're at a point where it's very demoralizing to be in the situation that we find ourselves in. And that's the top thing that I hear from our side and from our people that agree with us, is that what's the point? They've got control. They've done all this damage. It's going to take forever to turn it around. And there is merit to the argument that you're not going to get, if we retake the majority in 2024, it's not going to be like snapping your fingers and all of a sudden all this bad stuff goes away.
Right.
That's true. What the question comes down to is, are you willing to fight for your home? I mean, that is the question of 2024. Who are we as a state, and are we willing to fight for our home? And I'm concerned about the low amount of engagement, the low amount of energy, the negativity, the down in the dumps, the Debbie Downing scenario, because it's a predetermined outcome. If that's your approach, then yeah, we're going to lose. You've got to have faith. You got to walk in faith. You got to maintain the hope. We have truth and righteousness on our side. We have the people on our side, I believe. Like I said, there's a disconnect between values and governance. The values are there. They're just not connected to the governance. And so that's our task.
Very well said. And thank you for your time. Thank you for your service in the legislature. And good day to you, sir, and good day to you.